Chapter 4, Section 2, Outsourcing to an APEGA licensed professional or permit holder. When an APEGA licensed professional or permit holder outsources work to another APEGA licensed professional or permit holder not listed under its permit to practice, they can, as the outsourcing entity, rely on the authenticated professional work products produced by the outsourced entity. However, the outsourcing entity must document and follow an acceptable outsourcing process. For permit holders, the outsourcing process must be defined in their professional practice management plans. The documented outsourcing process must include the following 6 elements. 1. Scope of work. The outsourcing entity must clearly define the scope of the professional service being outsourced to APEGA-licensed entities. 2. Selection process. The outsourcing entity must consider previous experience demonstrating competency in delivering professional services similar to those defined in the scope of work, plus the professional reputation and status of the outsourced entity's APEGA license, and whether there are any outstanding disciplinary orders. 3. Compliance requirements. All compliance obligations must be communicated and accepted by both the outsourcing entity and the outsourced entity, including relevant statutes, regulations, bylaws, standards, and codes, and project-specific requirements, including regulatory and permitting requirements. 4. Quality control and assurance. The outsourcing entity must confirm that the outsourced entity has documented processes in place that are acceptable and adequate, and that those processes will be followed. This includes processes for quality control and assurance, authentication and validation, and outsourcing if subsequent outsourcing will be done by the outsourced entity. 5. Management of change. The outsourcing entity must confirm that an acceptable, adequate, and documented management of change process exists, and that it clearly identifies how the outsourced entity will be engaged in making changes. For permit holders, this can be confirmed by checking the appropriate sections of their professional practice management plan. 6. Interface management. When multiple outsourced entities are engaged in a project, an acceptable and adequate interface management process must be in place and followed to mitigate risks. The interface management process must include responsibilities of the outsourcing entity, responsibilities of each outsourced entity, protocols to manage changes in the scope of work of each outsourced entity that may affect the work of another outsourced entity, and the procedure for integrating multiple professional work products when required to ensure authentication and validation meet the requirements of the Authenticating Professional Work Products standard. We will now review an example.
ABC Construction, an APEGA permit holder, won a bid for a project to design and build a new commercial and residential development that includes a variety of buildings and a bridge. ABC Construction has in-house skills and experience in most aspects of the project, except the design and construction of bridges. The project manager appointed Arun, a structural engineer at ABC Construction, to lead the outsourcing of the design and construction of the bridge to another qualified company licensed by APEGA. What is Arun required to do to ensure ABC Construction complies with APEGA standards? Since the design and construction will be contracted to an outsourced entity that is licensed by APEGA, Arun must follow the outsourcing process outlined in ABC Construction's Professional Practice Management Plan. We will now review the steps in the process that Arun followed. First, Arun developed a document that clearly defined the scope of the professional services being outsourced by ABC Construction. Next, he solicited proposals from several APEGA permit holders, asking them to provide a description of previous experience that demonstrates their competency in designing bridges, a list of references, and confirmation that they are licensed by APEGA and not currently under a disciplinary order. Arun reviewed the proposals and documentation submitted by the permit holders. He assessed and compared each company based on their experience, reputation, knowledge, competency, and ability to meet ABC Construction's quality control and assurance requirements. Arun recommended Top-Notch Consulting as the best outsourced entity to provide the required service. Prior to work starting, Arun worked with Top-Notch Consulting to identify and document all compliance obligations and requirements, including those required by APEGA and the Government of Alberta, and industry standards and codes related to building, services, roads, and bridges, such as the Alberta Building Code and the Highway Bridge Design Code. Arun reviewed the relevant sections of Top-Notch Consulting's professional practice management plan to ensure that they had documented processes for quality control and assurance, authentication and validation, and outsourcing. He then provided Top-Notch Consulting a copy of ABC Construction's Management of Change process and reviewed it with them. To meet its deliverables for the project, Top-Notch Consulting hired 2 external subcontractors for the design and construction of specialized components for the bridge. What obligations does Top-Notch Consulting have to meet the requirements of the standard, relying on the work of others and outsourcing? As an APEGA permit holder, Top-Notch Consulting has the same due diligence obligations just described for ABC Construction. If the subcontractors hired by Top-Notch Consulting were not APEGA licensed professionals or permit holders, Top-Notch would have to follow a series of steps that are outlined in the next section of this chapter. Because Top-Notch Consulting outsourced separate components of the work to more than one entity, they established, communicated, and followed an interface management process. This process was acceptable to ABC Construction and provided clarity on the scope of work for each outsourced entity, including who was responsible for authentication and validation of work products, and how scope of work changes that affected more than one outsourced entity would be managed. The interface management process also outlined how all professional work products created for the design and construction of the bridge would be integrated.